The night began like a performance, staged for perfection. Our Connecticut estate glowed with light, every detail polished until it gleamed. The silverware shone as if it had never been touched. Candles flickered against marble walls, and laughter rose and fell like lines in a script. My father lifted his glass, his voice carrying through the cavernous dining room as he promised me the wedding of my dreams. Guests leaned in, nodding with admiration, their eyes on me, as though I were finally the center of this family's carefully curated world. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe it. At 28, after years of being the shadow in photographs, the afterthought in conversations, I wanted so badly to think that this night marked a turning point. My mother's smile sparkled across the table, her pearls catching the light, her hand resting gently over mine, as though to seal the promise. Then she leaned closer. Her perfume, sharp and floral, filled my lungs. Her lips moved words so quiet no one else could hear, yet they sliced through me like glass. My world cracked beneath the surface, invisible to the rest of the room. I froze, every sound muffled except the thud of my heart. And as the chandelier cast prisms across the table, I knew nothing about this perfect night was what it seemed. What she whispered would change everything. Would you have kept sitting at that table? The dining room of our Connecticut estate shimmered with curated elegance. A tableau lifted from a glossy magazine. Crystal wine glasses refracted light from the gilded chandelier, casting prisms that danced across the polished mahogany table. The aroma of rosemary roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen, blending with the sharp tang of my mother's Chanel perfume. My father, his face carved with lines of quiet authority, raised his glass, his voice steady as a judge's gavel. "Emily, we're giving you the wedding you deserve, a perfect day." My mother, her pearl earrings glinting like tiny moons, echoed with a poised smile. "Absolutely, darling, nothing less." At 28, after years of lingering on the edges of this family, their words ignited a fragile hope. I'd spent my childhood as the shadow in their spotlight, always a step behind my brother's triumphs. My throat tightened with gratitude, and I whispered, "Thank you," my eyes stinging with unshed tears. For once, I let myself believe I belonged. Then my mother leaned close, her breath sharp, her lips grazing my ear. "You're not our child," she whispered. The words pierced like a shard of glass. My fork slipped, clattering against the fine china. The room spun, but my father prattled on about peonies and guest lists, his eyes fixed on his plate as if nothing had happened. My fiancé Mark fidgeted with his phone thumbs, twitching nervously, avoiding my gaze. No one asked if I was okay. A scream lodged in my chest, but I swallowed it, terrified of what the truth might unravel. Dinner dissolved into strained silence, broken only by the scrape of silverware on plates. I excused myself, my smile brittle as cracked porcelain, and climbed the grand staircase to my childhood bedroom. Alone, I pressed my palms to my temples, tears spilling. Memories surged like a tide, the Christmas when I was 10, finding a dusty photo album in the attic, my face absent from every family portrait. The reunion, where an aunt, wineglass in hand, whispered I looked like a stranger she met years ago in Boston. The birthday my mother skipped, claiming she was tied up with my brother's soccer banquet, leaving me with a store-bought cake and no candles. I'd buried these wounds, convincing myself they were oversights, not clues. Now they roared to life, each one a brick in a wall I'd never seen. I wiped my face and marched to the den, where my father sat polishing his glasses, a nervous tick I'd come to recognize while flipping through a stack of paperwork. The room smelled of old leather and cigar smoke, a shrine to his control. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What Mom said?" He didn't look up, just adjusted his frames with deliberate care. "Let's focus on the wedding, Emily. It's a big moment for us all." My mother appeared in the doorway, her expression smooth as marble, her silk blouse immaculate. Later, she said coolly, her eyes locking onto mine with a warning. That word later hung heavier than silence, unraveling the fragile threads of my composure. Mark's behavior sharpened my dread. He'd always been attentive, his architect's precision charming in our early days, but now he took calls in hushed tones, stepping onto the patio when I entered, his voice dropping to a murmur. When I asked if something was wrong, he flashed a too-quick smile, brushing it off as just work stress at the firm, then kissed my forehead with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. I pressed, but his chuckle was forced, his eyes darting to his phone. "Everything's fine, Em," he said, but the nickname felt hollow. Nights stretched restless. I lay awake in my childhood bed, the canopy above me a relic of a girl I no longer recognized. My mother's whisper replayed sharp and certain, no matter how I tried to convince myself I'd misheard. Days blurred into hollow wedding planning cake flavors, seating charts, dress fittings, each moment heavy with unspoken truths. I caught myself staring at family photos on the staircase, searching for my features in their faces, finding none. A week later, after a late walk to clear my spiraling thoughts, I checked the mailbox by the driveway, its brass cold under my fingers. Among bills and glossy catalogs sat a plain envelope, my name scrawled in jagged ink. No return address. Under the flickering porch light, I tore it open, my pulse hammering. Inside was a faded photograph of a newborn swaddled in a hospital blanket, a tiny wrist bearing a bracelet with a name I didn't recognize, Clara. Beside the infant stood a weary woman, her hair damp with sweat, her face luminous with quiet strength. Scrawled on the back in dark ink, "The truth is waiting for you." The autumn air turned colder, biting through my coat. I gripped the photo, its edges creasing under my fingers. My mother's whisper, my father's evasion, Mark's secrecy, and now this, a child who might be me, held by a stranger. Standing on the porch, the photo trembling in my hand, I realized the life I'd clung to might never have been mine. I stayed frozen on the porch until the cold air forced me inside. Sleep never came. I sat at my desk, staring at the photograph until dawn began to creep through the blinds. The handwriting on the back gnawed at me. "The truth is waiting for you." By mid-morning, I had made up my mind. I needed answers, and I could not get them from my parents. I remembered my Aunt Lillian, my father's cousin, who had worked for decades at the Cook County Clerk's office before retiring. She had always been kind to me in small ways, slipping me cookies at family gatherings, asking about school when others ignored me. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but something told me she might know more than she had ever dared to say. I called her from my car, voice shaking, as I asked if we could meet. There was a long pause, then she agreed in a hushed tone. She suggested a diner outside of Naperville, where no one from the family would think to look. The next afternoon, I drove there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands ached. The diner was half empty, the smell of fried bacon heavy in the air. Lillian sat in a corner booth, her coat buttoned tight, though the heat was on. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand before speaking. Her eyes were tired, almost apologetic. She slid an envelope toward me. Inside was a copy of my birth certificate. At first glance it looked ordinary, but the signature of the attending physician was smudged the date of issue 3 weeks later than the supposed day of my birth. She whispered that she had seen these kinds of discrepancies before, and they always meant one thing. "You were adopted, Emily. It was legal from a children's home in Aurora, but your parents never wanted you to know. The adoption was tied to your grandparents' estate. Their will named you as an heir alongside Michael, and when they passed, the estate included the family's Denver property and a large block of shares in the development company." My chest felt hollow. I thought of the years I had asked about my grandparents and had been told they were complicated, best left in the past. I remembered being shushed when I pressed for stories being told to help clear the dishes instead. Lillian's voice wavered as she said my parents had always wanted control. By raising me as their own but hiding the truth, they thought they could claim my portion once the time came. She hesitated before adding something that chilled me more. Mark was part of it too. He had been promised financial support from my parents, a share of the company if the wedding went through. That was why he kept looking away when I asked questions. That was why his phone never left his hand. I left the diner with the certificate clutched in my bag, nausea rolling in my stomach. The drive back felt endless, the suburbs blurring by as if I were moving through a dream. When I walked into the house, my mother was arranging flowers on the table, her movements precise lips set in a thin line. I asked her if it was true, if I had been adopted, if everything had been a lie. Her hand froze midair, then she slammed the vase down so hard, water splashed onto the wood. Her face twisted with something darker than anger. "Stop digging into the past," she snapped. "You will ruin everything we have built." Her voice carried a sharpness I had never heard before, the kind that silenced any further question. My father appeared in the hallway, his expression closed, and walked away without a word. The sound of the door shutting behind him left me standing in the middle of the room, trembling. That night I could not sit still. I paced the bedroom, my mind circling around the photograph, the certificate, Lillian's warning. Finally, while Mark showered, I picked up his phone from the nightstand. My fingers shook as I entered the passcode I had seen him use 100 times. A string of messages glowed on the screen. They were short-clipped from my mother. "Confirm the meeting. Keep her calm until the papers are signed." And Mark's reply, one that made my stomach drop. "Don't worry, she suspects nothing." I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone cold in my palm, listening to the water run in the bathroom. The words blurred as my vision swam, but the meaning was sharp enough to slice through every shred of trust I had left. I placed the phone back where it had been, forcing my face into stillness as Mark stepped out with a towel over his shoulders. He smiled like nothing was wrong. I smiled back, hiding the storm breaking open inside me, already knowing that whatever came next, I could not trust him. The days that followed were like walking on broken glass. Every sound of Mark's phone buzzing set my nerves on edge. I started noticing how he slipped out onto the balcony for calls, his voice low, his shoulders tight. Once, as I passed by the sliding door, I caught the words, "I will keep my promise." His tone was sharp, urgent, and when he saw me through the glass, he ended the call so fast the screen still glowed in his hand. I tried to brush it aside, telling myself stress made me paranoid, but the photograph and the birth certificate still burned in my memory. Trust had already been cracked, and now the cracks widened every time his phone lit up. One Saturday he suggested dinner downtown, insisting on a small Italian restaurant we both loved. Candlelight flickered between us. Wine glasses clinked around the room, yet tension coiled in my chest. I watched his eyes dart toward his phone, even as the waiter poured water. I asked him directly what was going on. At first he smiled, tried to charm his way out, but I pressed harder. The smile vanished, his jaw clenched and his voice rose. "I didn't agree to keep lying for them." He spat, then shoved his chair back a little too hard. "But now I'm stuck." The words landed like a blow. I felt my stomach twist, the room blur. Other diners turned to look, then quickly looked away. He muttered an apology, ran a hand through his hair, but the damage was done. I excused myself to the restroom, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The man I thought I loved had just admitted he was part of their secret. I returned to the table, forcing calm, and we finished the meal in near silence. On the drive home, I kept my gaze fixed on the headlights streaking across the highway, saying nothing. That night, while he showered, I searched through the drawer of his desk. My hands shook as I rifled past receipts, business cards, until I found a manila folder tucked beneath a pile of bills. Inside was a contract stamped and notarized. It outlined a transfer of company shares from my parents' development firm to Mark's family upon completion of our marriage. At the bottom, my mother's signature was scrawled in familiar ink. I sank onto the chair, the pages trembling in my grip. So this was the prize he was promised, the reason for the secrecy, the reward for keeping quiet about who I truly was. Betrayal pressed down like a weight I could barely breathe under. When he emerged from the bathroom humming softly, I had already slipped the folder back. My face was composed, though inside I felt hollow. He leaned down to kiss my hair, and I forced a smile that never touched my eyes. The next days I decided not to confront him. I needed more than words, more than one contract. I needed to know the full scope of what I was up against. I watched carefully. I noted the times he disappeared for hours, the excuses about work, the way his phone buzzed, and he answered with his back turned. One evening, claiming he was meeting a client, he left in a pressed shirt and dark blazer. I followed 20 minutes later, my car a few lengths behind his. He parked outside a bar on the north side of Chicago, the kind with tinted windows and neon lights. Through the glass, I saw him slide into a booth. My mother was already there. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. They leaned in close, voices low, but their smiles unmistakable. Mark pulled a folder from his briefcase. My mother flipped through the pages, and then they clinked glasses like partners sealing a deal. Her pearl bracelet shimmered under the dim light as she patted his hand approval in her eyes. My stomach churned as I sat in the darkened car, watching the two people who were supposed to love me exchange secrets over drinks. I did not wait to see more. I drove away with the image burned into me, knowing that whatever I had just witnessed was only the beginning of what they were hiding. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed the sight of Mark and my mother leaning together, sharing secrets over drinks like business partners, not family. By morning, the need for real proof consumed me. I remembered Aunt Lillian's whisper that a friend of my grandfather's still practiced law downtown. It felt reckless to reach out, but recklessness was better than silence. I dialed the number she gave me, and a deep, careful voice answered. He introduced himself as Richard Harlan, retired but still consulting, and when I told him my name, there was a pause heavy enough to make my throat tighten. He agreed to meet in his office that afternoon. The building was an old brick structure near the Chicago River, the kind of place where dust hung in shafts of light. His office smelled of leather and coffee. Bookshelves crowded the walls, and framed photos of my grandfather lined a table by the window. Richard shook my hand and asked softly what had driven me here. I placed the copy of the suspicious contract on his desk. He studied it, sighed, then pulled a worn folder from a locked cabinet. Inside were scanned pages of my grandparents' original will. My breath caught as I read. My name was there in bold type. Despite being adopted, I was granted half the company shares and full rights to the Denver estate. But the version filed in probate court years ago was different. My name erased the shares, redirected to a clause marked for a lawful heir, a phrase vague enough to be twisted. Richard leaned forward and said he believed my mother orchestrated the alteration. By marrying me off and having my signature tied to new agreements, she could sell the assets without risk of dispute. The room felt smaller, air pressing in. I asked why my father had stayed silent. Richard's gaze dropped to the folder. Your father has debts, Emily. Heavy ones. Selling the shares is the only way out. I pushed back from the desk, anger rising. So I was nothing more than leverage. They dressed it up as family unity, but it was about survival and greed. Then Richard hesitated, flipping to a final page. There was a clause written in my grandfather's own hand, brief but haunting. In the event of dispute, the natural father of Emily retains the right to intervene on her behalf. My vision blurred as I read it again. Natural father. The words clanged inside me. Richard explained quietly that my birth father had given me up to avoid dragging me into a vicious family feud decades ago. He never rescinded his guardianship entirely. His identity was sealed in a separate document that Richard admitted he had never seen. I clutched the folder to my chest, fury mingling with grief. All these years of being told I was unworthy, invisible, while in truth, I had been written into the very foundation of the legacy they were desperate to steal. When I left the office, the city streets roared with traffic, but I felt suspended in silence. My mother's whisper, Mark's betrayal, my father's debts, and now the shadow of a man I had never known yet, who still held a place in my story. I returned home carrying the documents in my bag, like a weapon. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked sharper, harder. The wedding would go on as planned, but not for the reasons my parents imagined. For the first time since the photo appeared in my mailbox, I felt a grim clarity. If they thought I would be their pawn, they had forgotten that pawns can cross the board and change the game. I tucked the folder deep into my drawer, locked it, and listened to the murmur of voices downstairs. My mother was laughing faintly with Mark in the kitchen, a laugh I once thought meant warmth, but now sounded like triumph. I stood there gripping the key, knowing that when the vows were spoken and the signatures demanded, I would not be the obedient daughter they expected. I would be something they never prepared for. The weeks that followed blurred into a performance I never auditioned for. The Fairmont Hotel downtown was booked for the wedding, and every corner of my parents' world seemed to glitter with extravagance. Planners rushed in and out of our house with swatches of silk and portfolios of floral arrangements. Photographers circled like vultures, capturing smiles that felt rehearsed. Newspapers announced the union of two powerful families, painting it as a fairy tale. I played my part. I smiled at dress fittings, I let makeup artists study my skin. I tasted cakes and nodded politely. Inside, I carried the folder Richard had given me, like a flame pressed against my ribs. One afternoon, my mother handed me a cream envelope tied with a satin ribbon. She said it was a gift, a token of love, something to sign before the ceremony. I opened it later alone, heart thudding as I read the words. It was not a gift. It was a transfer of my inheritance disguised as generosity. My signature would make their scheme airtight. I pressed my pen against the page, pretending to admire the calligraphy, then slid it back into the envelope with a smile that made her believe she had won. During a fitting at a boutique on Michigan Avenue, I slipped into the dressing room with a gown heavy as snowfall. As I adjusted the lace, voices drifted from the adjoining room. My mother's sharp tone cut through the fabric wall. She said Mark was just a pawn useful until the estate was secured, then I would be erased from the picture. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed against the door. Mark's reply was strained, almost desperate. He said he had no choice, that if he refused something from his past would be exposed. My mother's silence afterward was colder than any threat. I stood there trembling in white satin, staring at my reflection, the bodice clinging to my chest like armor I had never chosen. Rage spread through me, but so did clarity. The wedding was a trap, and I was standing in the center of it. That night, I met Rachel, my oldest friend from college, at a quiet diner outside the city. She had become a reporter for the Tribune, chasing scandals in politics and business. Over coffee that had gone cold, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then slid a small recorder across the table. "Use it," she whispered. "Gather proof. When the time is right, we will burn their story down." I tucked the device into my purse, its weight a strange comfort. Back home, I stepped into the closet, where the gown hung in its protective cover, gleaming under the soft light. I unzipped it slowly and let my fingers glide over the fabric. The dress was pure, unblemished, a symbol meant to dazzle hundreds of strangers. In the mirror, I saw my own face above it, pale but determined eyes dark with knowledge. I whispered to my reflection that I would wear the gown, I would walk the aisle, but I would not be their sacrifice. The mirror gave nothing back except the ghost of a woman who had already decided her next move. I learned quickly how to keep my smile steady. At family dinners, I let my mother fuss over centerpieces and nod when my father outlined guest lists. I laughed at Mark's jokes, even as I pictured him sliding documents across a bar table. Every gesture was a mask. Behind it, Rachel and I were building something far sharper than a smile. She showed me how to set up a secure account to track my mother's emails. Late at night, in the quiet of my room, we sifted through attachments, proposals, and hidden folders. One message outlined the transfer of company assets, my name used as a shield to avoid legal scrutiny. Another chain revealed Mark's willingness to comply so long as his debts were cleared. I copied every file, my hands cold on the keyboard. Rachel slipped me a recorder small enough to hide in a pocket. I used it during a call between my parents and Mark, their voices clear as they discussed the timeline. My father's tone was impatient, my mother's precise. Mark's silence in between spoke louder than anything. When the call ended, I played it back again and again until their words carved into me. Richard's copy of the original became the cornerstone. We scanned it, watermarked it, and tucked digital versions into multiple drives. Rachel pieced together a presentation that could run without me, timed to the exact moment vows would end. She called it insurance. Yet every night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a battle raged inside. I imagined leaving Chicago with nothing but a suitcase, starting fresh in another state where no one knew my name. A life without marble floors or chandeliers, but without deceit, too. Then I imagined standing in that grand ballroom, lifting my chin, as their faces crumbled under the truth. One dream offered peace, the other offered justice. The sleepless hours dragged me back to childhood memories I had buried. Sitting alone at school recitals, while other parents clapped, pretending not to notice when family portraits were taken without me. Birthdays that passed with little more than a card. Each memory stitched itself into a vow stronger than any promise they could force me to make. One night, as I practiced walking in my shoes, Rachel's name lit up my phone. Her voice shook. "Emily, I found something. If you go through with this without exposing them, they will erase you completely." She paused, then added that she had uncovered a contingency plan, a set of forged documents prepared to accuse me of fraud. The bouquet I had been holding slipped from my hand petals, scattering across the floor. My reflection in the full-length mirror stared back the gown, gleaming white against the shadows of the room. I picked the bouquet up slowly, heart pounding, with a mix of terror and resolve. In that moment, I knew the path was no longer split. There was no running, no quiet escape. The only way forward was through the fire they had lit for me. I would step into the aisle with steady hands, but the truth would be waiting behind me like a storm ready to break. The bells of St. Paul's rang out across the courtyard as I stood at the heavy wooden doors. Photographers jostled for the perfect shot, while guests in designer gowns and tailored suits filled the pews. My father's hand rested firmly on my arm, his grip steady, his smile practiced. I could feel the pressure of his palm as much as the weight of everything he was hiding. The aisle stretched before me like a stage. Chandeliers glowed above polished marble, the murmur of expectation humming in my ears. I walked with deliberate calm, each step echoing against the vaulted ceilings. At the altar, Mark waited pale but composed, though I saw the flicker in his eyes when they met mine. The ceremony moved forward, words of love and unity drifting like smoke. Then the minister announced it was time to sign the marriage and financial agreements documents laid neatly on a side table. My father guided me forward, his voice low, urging me to take the pen. I lifted my head, drew a steady breath and spoke. "Stop." The sound cut through the silence. I nodded toward the technician Rachel had arranged hidden among the staff. The lights dimmed and the screen behind the altar flickered to life. Gasps rippled through the church as images appeared. The falsified birth certificate, the altered will emails between my mother and Mark discussing the transfer. Their voices filled the speakers, clear and undeniable. My mother's calm calculation, Mark's hesitant compliance. Whispers surged like a wave. I turned to face the crowd. "I am adopted," I declared, "but my inheritance was stolen, my life rewritten to serve their debts." Mark stepped forward, stammering that it was a misunderstanding, but the screen showed his own words agreeing to keep the secret. His face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing, with nothing left to defend. My mother's composure cracked as guests turned toward her, cameras flashing. She demanded the screen be shut off, but the evidence rolled on. My father raised a hand, his voice shaking as he shouted enough. He admitted the truth that debts had consumed them, that my mother orchestrated the deception to strip me of my rights. Then with eyes heavy he added, "What struck me silent. There was another reason. Your real father asked us to protect you, to keep you hidden from a family war that would have destroyed you." The room erupted. Guests pushed back from pews, reporters rushed toward the altar. The organist stopped mid-note. Some people fled for the doors. Others raised their phones high, capturing every second. I stood at the center bouquet, trembling in my grip, watching the empire my parents built collapse under the weight of their own secrets. And beneath the chaos, one phrase echoed in my head sharper than the rest. My real father. The storm had broken, but it had only just begun. Reporters swarmed the church steps before I could even catch my breath. Flashes blinded me as microphones pushed forward voices demanding to know how long I had known what I would do next if the marriage was truly over. By the next morning, the Tribune and the Sun-Times splashed headlines about the wedding collapse across their front pages. Every channel played clips of my mother's voice admitting her plan. Mark's face caught in shock, my father breaking under the weight of his own confession. Federal investigators soon arrived at the family offices. Agents from the IRS and state inheritance courts pulled files, froze accounts, and issued subpoenas. For the first time in my life, the people who had taught me to stay silent were forced to speak under oath. Rachel and I walked into the courthouse 3 weeks later with boxes of evidence. The recordings, the altered documents, the original will Richard had preserved, all of it laid neatly before the judge. I sat at the plaintiff's table, trembling but steady. Across from me, my mother avoided my eyes, her lawyer whispering frantically, while Mark sat alone, pale, no ring on his hand. My father did not appear. His seat remained empty, a silent admission of retreat. The judge listened carefully as my attorney presented the trail of deception. When my mother tried to deny the recordings played, and the room grew quiet, except for her voice condemning herself, I lifted my chin and said that I was adopted, yes, but I was also named as heir, and I would not allow their debts and lies to erase my rights. Then the courtroom doors opened, and a man stepped inside. He was older, his hair streaked with silver, his suit tailored with effortless confidence. I recognized the shape of my own eyes in his face, before the clerk even announced his name. Daniel Carter, founder of Carter Development in Denver, a company that had weathered recessions and still stood tall. My breath caught as he addressed the judge. He said he had once loved my mother but had been pushed aside when family wars over money threatened to tear everything apart. To protect me, he had signed away custody, trusting that I would be raised in safety, not in secrecy. His voice cracked as he admitted he had stayed silent too long. I did it to protect her, he said, but I am here now to acknowledge her as my daughter, and to make amends. He offered a statement of support and documents granting me shares from his own company, a separate inheritance no one had expected. Tears blurred my vision as the gavel came down. The estate was restored to me, the Denver property, and half of the company shares confirmed as mine. My mother faced charges of financial fraud and obstruction, her pearl composure shattered. The judge denied her bail. Mark tried once to speak to me in the hallway, his eyes pleading, but I turned away without a word. My father vanished from public view, rumors swirling that he had left the country. In the weeks that followed, I stood in the Denver estate's wide halls, papers of ownership finally in my hands. I refused offers from old board members to take my parents' place. Instead, I launched my own consulting firm, small at first, advising young developers on ethical growth. Rachel became my first partner, her investigative instincts shaping the integrity we promised clients. I cut ties with Mark entirely. He called, he sent letters, but I never responded. The final time he showed up at the estate gates, I instructed security to escort him off the property. His figure disappearing down the long drive felt like the closing of a book I had once mistaken for my story. One evening I stood on the balcony as dawn broke, the fields glowing with early light. The wedding had been ruined, but my life was finally mine to build. The weight of the past lifted slowly, replaced by a quiet strength. If you have followed me through every secret betrayal and storm, tell me what you think. Would you have walked away or stood and fought? Share your thoughts and stay with me, because the story of what came after has only just begun.